through Tryst with Liz. We did 2 years together, and I've heard part of her paper, because this is her graduation paper, but I haven't heard all of it, and I think it's going to be fantastic. I'm very honored. Liz and I went through a lot together, and she was just fantastic. So when she agreed to present this paper, I'm like, oh, all the feels. You guys get to enjoy all the feels that I did too. So we'll take a break about halfway through. That way you guys can use the bathroom or whatever. Breakfast, snacks over there if you guys want anything. Liz is going to do about 90 minutes of presentation. We'll take a break, and then she's going to present our paper, and then we'll do Q&A. CEUs will be sent out. Make sure you signed in. As long as you signed in, give us about a week. So if you don't see it by next Saturday, check your junk folder, and then send us an email. But there's a lot of people here, and we do have to make sure we got everybody on there to send it. But if you don't see it by next Saturday, shoot us an email, but check your junk folder because our emails as well if you go to spam. So anyway, thank you guys. I'm going to pass it over to Liz.
Thank you, Jessica. So, as Jessica said, the format today is going to be about 90 minutes of a PowerPoint presentation that I created a couple of years ago and have been sort of refining since then. And I've presented it to groups of therapists who are not necessarily psychodynamic therapists. So there is some education about sort of psychodynamic theory, and then there's also specifically some of the terminology that we use in intersubjective self-psychology, because God forbid there be a new theory without its own jargon. So we're going to just go through that real quick. And then after this portion, after the PowerPoint portion, we'll take a break, come back, and I will present the paper that I wrote at the end of my 2-year certification program at Tryst. And some of the historical ground will be revisited, but it will serve in the paper to contextualize the central narrative, which is my relationship with a particular patient. So I'm Liz. My pronouns are she and her. I am an Oklahoma native. I was born in Muskogee. My brother and I both were. This is my brother, Dr. John Fletcher. And we moved a lot. We moved all around southeastern Oklahoma, some in Missouri, South Louisiana, and we came back here. So all of this material, however painful it feels to revisit, is material that is as much a part of me as it is a part of all of you. And so I just want to invite you to consider that whatever painful feelings are stirred up are evidence of your love for this state, for these people, your care about justice generally, and evidence that you have a strong moral center. So the red dirt mentality phrase, I have to say first, comes from my best friend, Alicia Lincoln, who is a public health professional. And when I started to have thoughts that eventually coalesced into this presentation, I was talking to her about it, and she said, yeah, this is a thing we know about in public health. We call it the red dirt mentality. It is a well-known phenomenon, but I could not find any literature on it specifically. So this is my attempt to sort of create a framework from my own perspective as a psychodynamically informed psychotherapist. Joy Harjo has been poet laureate. She is a Creek poet, the Muskogee Creek Nation. And she is native, obviously, to Oklahoma. And like me, she lives here because she loves this state. She loves the people. And she has a deep appreciation for the history, even as traumatic and painful as it is. This is from Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings. When we made it back home, back over those curved roads that wind through the city of peace, we stopped at the doorway of dusk as it opened to our homelands. We gave thanks for the story, for all parts of the story, because it was by the light of those challenges we knew ourselves. We asked for forgiveness. we laid down our burdens next to each other. So objectives, I assume everybody has already kind of read these. We're going to learn about some things. We're going to revisit, really, because I assume you all mostly know a lot of the Oklahoma history points we're going to cover, but we're going to revisit specifically from a psychoanalytic perspective. And we're going to think about the red dirt mentality, what it means clinically in the psychoanalytic situation, and how it shows up for us. All photos are either photos that I have taken with my own camera, or they are stock photos that I have purchased online. All vignettes, all clinical vignettes, are anonymized to protect patient confidentiality. So in 2012, I found myself at Smith College in Massachusetts. I was sitting in a day-long seminar on psychoanalytic psychotherapy, and the instructor paired us into dyads. We spoke with one another about our practices. So the social worker that I was paired with was a Jewish therapist who worked primarily with Holocaust survivors and their descendants. Every Jewish person has a bag packed, she told me. Sometimes for the actual Holocaust survivors, it is a literal go bag, under the bed, in the closet, packed full of clothes, ready to go. She described this more metaphorical packed bag as an always present awareness that at any moment you might have to pull up roots and leave. No matter how safe you feel, any environment, any situation can become suddenly, desperately unsafe. So then she asked me about my practice in Oklahoma. As I talked through the populations that I worked with, she said, "What do you think Oklahomans have? If it's not a packed bag, what is it?" What would you say? Well, this is what came to mind for me. You might want to turn the volume up on that a little bit. I don't know if you all know this song. This is Freddie Hole by Oklahoma artist Mike Hosty, the Hosty Duo. And the first time I heard this song, I remember thinking, that is the oakiest damn song I have ever heard. He says, "You was in the front playing with your hose, should have been in your Freddie hole." And then he just talks about Freddie holes and all the different situations that you might want to jump in one. This is a quote from Oklahoma novelist Rilla Askew. "You can't build against wind, but you can dig." This photo is from the 1942 tornado that hit Pryor, Oklahoma. Yep, go ahead and turn it back up, because we're going to need the volume up for the clinical vignettes. Not my volume. So that is the issue, okay? So how about when there is sound that needs to play, I put myself on mute?
Do you have the microphone on?
This one is just for the online, for the recording. No. So when I unplug mine, that doesn't work. Okay. All right, we're just going to figure it out. It's okay. Yes. Like OBs do. Some more Freddie holes here. Okay, so now it's time to visit the jargon. Some of you may be really intimately familiar with these terms. which is fine. We're just going to kind of revisit some of them. The particular psychoanalytic perspective that I'm coming from with this work is intersubjective self-psychology. So self-psychology was developed by Heinz Kohut in the mid-20th century. And that framework sort of stipulated that in order for normal development to happen, people need a caregiving surround filled with attuned, empathic others who provide experiences specifically of mirroring, idealization, and twinship. And we will visit those again. So that's self-psychology. In the 90s, Bob Stolorow, Atwood, developed intersubjectivity theory. And that theory is just based on the reality, really, that we are all part of systems of interrelatedness, and we cannot be understood outside of that context of relational connectedness. So intersubjective means my subjective experience, my feelings, my inner self, blended with your subjective experience, your feelings, your inner self and perceptions, and together we co-create an intersubjective experience. So mirroring, twinship, and idealization are the three sort of main lines of transference themes in both self-psychology and intersubjective self-psychology. Mirroring is about being seen and recognized. Now, archaic mirroring, so like little bitty kids, right, need to feel that mirroring gaze is admiring, even adoring. The more mature developmental progress of mirroring involves just feeling recognized and seen for who we know ourselves to be. I feel like Mr. Rogers, and I'm an enormous Mr. Rogers fan, I will talk about him at the drop of a hat. Mr. Rogers does this really, really well. I don't know if any of you remember watching his show or have seen it since, but he engages in a kind of mirroring at the end of every episode. Do you remember he would say, you make this day special just by being you. There is no one else in the world like you, and people can love you exactly as you are. And we have lost the mirroring. Yeah, that's what they call this, the screen mirroring. Okay, there we go. Maybe good. There we go. Yeah. Y'all, okay. So, what is the definition of self? In the super basic, like, pedestrian language of psychoanalysis, I'm being sarcastic, it is described as a theoretical abstraction that stands for the complex set of experiences and fantasies each of us has about ourselves and who we know and feel ourselves to be. I do not know why analysts cannot write more clearly and use plain language, but they do not do it. So what that means is just our sense of who we are and everything that informs that sense sort of impacts how we feel and who we feel we are. We're also going to be talking a little bit about fantasies. The adult entertainment industry has really co-opted that term in an unfortunate way. But in psychoanalysis, when we talk about fantasies, we're kind of talking about literally anything one imagines. Whatever we imagine about other people, about the future, about ourselves. There's a specific kind of fantasy that ISP talks about, self-object fantasies, felt experiences of self and others. So who I feel this other person is and who I feel I am with this other person, those are fantasies not in the sense that they aren't objectively true or real or factually grounded, but they're fantasies in the sense that they come from our subjective experience. A self-object is an internalized experience of any important other. So initially, these are our caregivers, right? The caregiving surround. We internalize aspects of those caregivers and they become our self-objects. We are going to talk a little bit about some grandiosity, and that comes up a lot in the idealization line of transference. So idealization is exactly what it sounds like. It's imagining that the other is perfect, which gives us a sense of being perfect enough by proximity. Grandiose self-object fantasies is the situation where all perfection is located within me, and all badness is exported or projected onto an other. And I can only be, sometimes this also involves idealization of a sort of grandiose other. So admiration of an authoritarian strongman, for example, and I can borrow that person's perfection. My proximity through ideological worship of this person grants me perfection and immunity from shame, primarily. The twinship fantasy is the fantasy of an identical other. The archaic version, right, is little kids imagining that they have met someone exactly like them, and we like all the same things, and we play exactly the same way, and everything we do is just same. The more mature expression of that is just feeling like you belong in humanity, that you are a human among other humans with commonalities that help to feel like you can resonate with other people. So defenses, I hopped ahead a little bit there. Another thing about the self, sorry. Ideally, in sort of normal development, the self that develops is emergent and fluid. And what that means is it is responsive and resilient. So responsive to external stimuli, but not dependent on those stimuli. Resilient in the sense that I can persist in a relatively stable awareness and sense of myself throughout a wide variety of circumstances. The other option, when normal development has been interrupted with rupture or trauma, is that sometimes that sense of self becomes fixed and rigid. And that is when we get kind of fragile. We cannot metabolize feelings that feel threatening to ourselves, like shame, and so we engage defenses. So defenses protect a status quo, and it's not always a great status quo, right? Sometimes it is a status quo that is just barely getting us by. But as we'll see in some of the vignettes, if we're able to hear them, as we'll see in some of the vignettes, sometimes just getting by feels like all we can hope for. I want to talk particularly about the defense of self-righteousness, which I like to call the heroine of defenses, because it feels so good to employ. It is sort of the poor man's self-esteem, right? If you do not have a sense of yourself that is grounded in reality, relatively positive, relatively stable, then anything that rocks your boat, anyone coming to you with critical feedback saying you really hurt my feelings, it crushes you. It absolutely implodes that fragile bubble of self. And at that point, you have a choice between feeling wretched, absolutely wretched, or tossing the shame hot potato to somebody else, which feels really good because self-righteousness transforms shame into contempt for others, which is such a better way to feel in terms of gratification than feeling contempt for ourselves, right? So structure and organization. That refers to how relationships and experience are internalized in a way that makes sense to the individual. So when we are working with someone clinically, or when we're just talking to someone, we get a sense of how they organize their world, how information makes sense to them, how events in the world, in their life, make sense in their sort of worldview. And finally, this is specific to ISP, And Jessica and I were just talking about, there is some very heated, intense debate about the nature of these terms. I'm just going to use the definitions that I like best, honestly. So the leading edge in intersubjective self-psychology refers to the development enhancing modes of relatedness. So a relationship or a mode of relatedness, a way of relating that feels like it sort of helps someone along, helps them to work with their experiences. There is also trailing edge transference, and that refers to the repetitive cycles of relational rupture. Every single person that we see in our practices has experienced relational rupture. In fact, every single person we don't see in our practices has experienced relational rupture, because it just happens. We are humans. Now, the trailing edge is that dread to repeat. It is the fear that what has happened to me before will happen again with this person in this situation. It is always easier to identify the trailing edge than it is to identify the leading edge. But what's nice about ISP and the way that they frame these ideas is that the trailing edge always points to the leading edge in some way, because in that trailing edge, there are the seeds of the yearning, the hope that is pulling someone forward into connectedness, despite having been wounded through connectedness in the past. So an example of this is when someone comes to see me for the first time, they may be terrified that I am going to hurt them or judge them or abandon them in the same ways that other people in the past have. But what does that mean about what they might be hoping for? Maybe they're hoping that by some miracle they might have a different experience with me. And so the trailing edge is easy to focus on. Sometimes we can get sort of sucked into that. But in that trailing edge, we are always going to encounter what Marion Tolkien calls the tendrils of health, that tentative yearning for a corrective experience. And we are about to have another audio thing. So let's see how this goes.
I feel another migraine coming on, as usual, I guess. It doesn't matter. I'll do what I have to do. I don't have a choice. Josh stood the girls up again this weekend. I hate that for them, but it also creates difficulty for me. I've been planning on being able to clean the house and rearrange Mom's room so it's easier to get her to her potty chair next to her bed. When I figured out he wasn't coming, I had already wasted half the day waiting for him, and then I had to wrangle the girls while I tried to clean the house. I know my church folks would help out. They keep telling me to let them know if I need anything. I just can't bring myself to say I need someone to watch my kids so I can give my mom a bath, or I need someone to sit with Mom so I can go to the grocery store or take the girls to the dentist or whatever. I wish my brothers would help, but they live out of state. They do the same thing. They tell me to let them know what I need. Well, I need someone to be here. Come mow the lawn, take Mom to the doctor. Call the pharmacy that left a message 3 days ago that I haven't had a chance to return. But when they say that, what they mean is, keep doing it all, sis. Keep having no expectations of us so we can tell ourselves we're doing all we can. I don't know, maybe I'm being unfair. I just feel like when people say, let me know if you need anything, they don't really want to help. They're hoping you'll say thank you and never call. That's what it feels like. And I still have that lawyer's number, but I can't imagine being able to pay for even an hour or two of their time, let alone enough to force Josh to pay what he owes or figure out how to transfer ownership of the house from Mom to me. I wish Mom had done this before dementia got so bad, but she was so proud of living in the house her grandfather built. She wanted me to inherit it, but she didn't want to transfer ownership while she was still alive. And now she really needs a nursing home memory care center, but Medicare won't pay for that, and without Medicaid we can't afford it. And with the house and with my income, even just as a nurse, we can't qualify. I know Mom would be devastated if I sold the house, plus we'd hardly get anything for it because it needs so much work. And my brothers don't understand why I need to sell it. They don't want to live here, but they wouldn't be on board with me selling. Not that I even have the right to. I'm not on the deed or the title. I don't know. You told me about resources out there, but I just can't call those numbers. There are so many people in worse shape than we are. I couldn't bring myself to take resources somebody else needs.
So you probably heard both some trailing edge, right, and maybe also some leading edge there with Angela. Just kind of keep that in mind. Keep the themes in mind, what her hopes are, what her dreads are as we move forward. And I've lost my screen. Okay, here we go. All right, so this is not Oklahoma bashing. As I said, I love this state. This is also not pathologizing geography or culture or even ideology. And it's not an attempt to make anyone feel bad. I think we'll probably all feel kind of bad when we'll feel some painful feelings together. But again, those painful feelings are a reminder that we care about things. This really was inspired by my own search for understanding. And is intended to be a compassionate exploration of historical trauma and how it shows up for us today, especially in Oklahoma. We together are going to be kind of seeking a pathway to a whole cohesive and empowering sense of self, not just individually, but collectively as Oklahomans. But first, we've got to talk about how not okay Oklahoma is. So these are all statistics you can look up. NAMI does a great job of compiling these every year. These are from 2025. 768,000 adults in Oklahoma have a diagnosed mental health condition. Nearly 20% of the unhoused population has a mental illness. And I wanted to say that because I think actually the perception, the stereotype is that that number is much higher, but actually it's only around 20%. Nearly 30% of adults in Oklahoma were unable to get counseling. Over 1.9 million Oklahomans live in communities without enough mental health professionals. 60% of Oklahoma teenagers who have depression received no mental health help last year. Last year, there were 857 suicides and 132,000 adults reporting thoughts of suicide. The ratio of school psychologists to students in Oklahoma is 1 to 4,333. Yeah. Are any of you familiar with YRBS? Yeah, the Youth Behavior Risk Survey. My friend Alicia, who works in the health department, is involved with compiling these data. It talks about, it does surveys to determine how many students have experienced ACEs. ACEs are adverse childhood events. Some of them are listed there. But also some focus has shifted recently to determining how many students are also experiencing positive childhood events, PCEs. And so PCEs are defined as, having a caring or supportive adult in their life, having a caring or supportive friend, having a sense of belonging at school, right? Because these go back to those transference themes, right? Idealization, twinship, mirroring, feeling like you belong. And what we found is that the presence, or rather the absence of positive childhood experiences is more negatively impactful than the presence of adverse childhood experiences. The absence of positive experiences is more negatively impactful than the presence of adverse experiences. So not having a caring adult is worse for kids in terms of their mental health and development than being abused in some situations. So think about this. What made you curious about this presentation? What dynamics were you maybe thinking of in your own social surround? What comes to mind as we cover the ground that we're going to cover today? What is your connection to Oklahoma? How did you or your family get here? And how do you think that history impacts you and your loved ones today? So how did we get here? Why does Oklahoma exist? Well, because of broken treaties and genocide. So in the 18th century, around 1763, everything in blue was Indian territory. That is what was not open for white colonization in 1763. Gradually, as you can see, more and more land is quote unquote opened to white colonization. The red areas are reservations that were set aside, and native nations were removed forcibly to those reservations. And by the time we get to the end of the 19th century, we're working with practically nothing. The way this happened was with the full-throated support of every voter at that time. This is a quote from Andrew Jackson's second annual message to Congress in 1830. It gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government steadily pursued for nearly 30 years in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements is approaching to a happy consummation. 2 important tribes have accepted the provision made for their removal at the last session of Congress, and it is believed that their example will induce the remaining tribes to seek the same obvious advantages. Yeah. So these policies, literal policies of genocide and eradication of native existence and culture, persisted through the 1970s. They were called by different names, but assimilation was elimination by other means. There were laws limiting what indigenous people could do on their land. Those laws are still in effect today and contribute to the rampant poverty that we think of when we think about native reservations. The Indian Appropriations Act negated the idea that native nations were sovereign nations capable of making treaties. And so after that, no treaties were made or recognized. And then Congress voted in 1903 that it had the power to override treaties. We have another recording, so I'm gonna turn my mic off. This is Dustin's story. Think about leading edge and trailing edge, and then think about what Dustin might be hoping for.
Man, I don't know. It just feels like every time there's a light at the end of the tunnel, something comes up to take it away. But that's just life. I'll get through it. I did it again, didn't I? I said something negative, and then I tried to make it positive. Yeah, I guess I can't stand to leave things in that negative place. I don't know why. Back when I was playing ball, that's how our coaches would talk to us. It doesn't matter what hurts, you get up and finish the game. I guess that's how my dad talked to us too. He's just always been that way. One foot in front of the other, do what you gotta do, this is how life is. Life is work, hard work. And then someday you die, and that's when you get a break. That doesn't really sound all that positive, does it? Maybe it's just resigned. I never really thought about the difference. Resigned is what felt like positivity to me. That's why when people are like, you better take better care of yourself or you'll wind up stroking out or having a heart attack or whatever, I'm like, don't threaten me with a good time. That's just how my family has always been. I mean, we were forced into Oklahoma at the end of a rifle, and we live in kind of the butthole of the state. Lots of high school dropouts, lots of meth overdoses. Me and my sister are some of the only kids in my high school who actually got out. She's got an okay job as a teacher. She helps take care of my dad, and I work for the state, which in my family is kind of the height of security and stability, but I don't know, it just feels empty. Me and my sister both have so much student debt. She worked hers off by working at a terrible school that couldn't keep teachers. But because I got my master's in accounting, my debt burden is so much bigger. It just feels like I'm going to be hacking away at debt for the rest of my life. And then, like my dad says, you die. The end.
So there's a lot of pretty obvious trailing edge there, right? And yet also that determination to keep on putting one foot in front of the other is something that you will continue to hear as we hear another couple of stories later on. So let's talk about how colonization happened in the land that was promised to 38 Native nations. We like to talk about the land run. There were actually quite a few land runs. This is just a timeline. And every time it says a county was created or that lands were opened, what that means is that a treaty that was made with a sovereign nation was revoked, was violated, and that all of the members of that nation lost the land that they had lived on. Native people were not allowed to make claims during land runs. It goes on and on, all the way to 1906, when the last of the land auctions happened. So who colonized Oklahoma? We do not have any demographics from the actual land runs, but there was a census in 1910. And that census shows that there were quite a few African Americans, there were a lot of women among the first non-native settlers. There were a lot of what they called back then new immigrants. So Jewish people, Polish people, Slavs, Italians. Total population in 1910 was about 1.7 million, 8% African American, 4.5% indigenous, 2.8% foreign-born, 6% had parents who were foreign-born, and German speakers outnumbered any other non-English speaking groups. The interesting thing about those Germans is that they actually came from Russia. Most of the German settlers in Oklahoma had been exiled from Russia. They had settled land in Russia that Russia could not get Russians to settle. And so Russia said, come on over, Germans, you can farm, you can practice your own religion, you're not going to be conscripted into the military, don't have to learn Russian, just be your own thing. And then 100 years later, they changed their mind, and they said, we need you all to join the Russian Orthodox Church, to send your sons into the military, and we also need that land back. So those people left left Russia, and came to the United States, and a lot of them wound up in Oklahoma. All of these groups had historical trauma. We'll talk a little more about kind of the details of that later, but just keep in mind, these are people who came here as a destination of last resort. And then shortly after Oklahoma statehood, a horrific attack happened. So who all, just show of hands, who all studied the Tulsa Race Massacre in school? I did, it was mentioned. What was it called?
Race riots.
The race riot, yeah, that's what it was called when I was in school. And then, just a show of hands, has anybody ever read a book about it? Yeah. There are some fantastic books out there, but it's shocking how few Oklahomans seek that out. Maybe it's not that shocking. So Greenwood had a thriving community of African Americans. It was known nationally. This place was famous all over the United States. It was called Black Wall Street. Thriving businesses, prosperous people. People could start a business, make a life, build a house. And almost all of the folks who settled Greenwood were fleeing white supremacist terrorism in the Deep South after the Civil War. And you can tell the nature of Greenwood, what it represented by some of the ways it's referred to in literature. So there's Death in the Promised Land by Scott Ellsworth, Fire in Beulah by Willa Askew. And there are a lot of things written about Greenwood that refer to it as a kind of promised land. Many white families envied the prosperity of Greenwood. So the massacre happened, and I'm not sure how many people know the details that led up to it. There's a lot of debate about these details because they weren't recorded. No one felt comfortable or safe talking about this for years after it happened. But on May 30th, 1921, Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black boy, rode an elevator to the colored restrooms in a building. That elevator was operated by a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page, and reports kind of vary. Some reports say that Sarah had an ingrown toenail and that Dick inadvertently stepped on it, or that he tripped when the elevator lurched and he accidentally touched her. But she screamed and someone called the police. So Dick was arrested, and after his arrest, rumors of a lynching spread like wildfire. These were not crazy rumors. Just a month before, a black man had been lynched when a white mob overran that same jail. So black World War I veterans who were living in the community got word that Dick was in danger and might be lynched, and so they brought their service weapons down to the jailhouse where a white mob had formed, and that white mob had looted white-owned hardware stores for pickaxes and shovels and bullets and guns. At some point, a shot rang out, and the massacre started as the white mob descended on Greenwood. Some of the after effects of Greenwood, they tried to rebuild almost immediately, and city ordinances were passed to prevent black families from rebuilding. And then in the 1960s, urban renewal, which was also, I'm not making this up, it was also known as black removal, finished what the massacre started. So in the wake of that massacre, more than $27 million in property loss, at least 300 people dead, probably more. There's been a decline in home ownership among African American families, lower occupational status, net worth, educational attainment. This is today. These effects are still persisting today. Today, the typical black household in Tulsa has only 6 cents of wealth for every dollar of wealth a white household has. This is a direct result of the massacre. White Tulsans are twice as likely to own a home as black Tulsans. No one has ever been prosecuted or charged with any crime in connection with the massacre. So we're about to listen to Shauna's story. And when I was compiling these, I hadn't listened to these in a while, and I realized that Shauna is really the best example of someone who has transformed a trailing edge phenomenon into a leading edge. So listen for that.
My feet are killing me. This is the first time I sat down all day. Not that I ever sat much at my job, but since the start of this school year, my assistant principal made it clear they expect us to be on our feet at all times. We want to see you up and moving is what they keep saying. My dad told me not to go into teaching, but then he never did the smart thing either. He was always working at least 2 jobs. Thank goodness his state job paid the bills and provided insurance because his church jobs never did. We were those preacher's kids who emptied the trash and cleaned out the church after every service. But at least growing up in Bowie, I had teachers and role models who were Black my whole life. I just want these kids to have the same thing. For some of them, I'm their first Black teacher. Can you believe that? Inner city kids in Oklahoma City. It's sad. But I wish my parents would leave Bowie. They won't even consider it, even though they have to drive over an hour to get to the doctor. They feel safer there. I get that, kind of. It's just a lot to worry about with them so far away. Between that and all the politics in my school now, my assistant principal came to my room at the beginning of the year. She's always been supportive of how I make sure to have posters and quotes of people with life experiences that are relevant to my kids. But this year she said, "Shauna, you've got to take down that John Lewis quote. Take down that Audre Lorde poster. You can leave Martin Luther King Jr. up, but you've got to put some George Washington or something up too." When I told her that was crazy, she didn't disagree, but she said, "You need to think of the most unreasonable parent ever. Anything at all that parent might object to, you need to get rid of." I was like, what's going to be left? And then she dropped the bomb. You know how I spent all summer reading so I could curate a reading list full of stories that are relevant to my students' lives? I was really proud of it this year. I was excited to teach it. My assistant principal said to throw it out, all of it. She said we can't read stories featuring human characters, too political. Only stories with animals. I went home and cried. I was so frustrated, but I have a plan. They want animal characters? Well, the joke's on them. We're reading Animal Farm.
So there's a lot of people rolled into Shauna, obviously, but that is a true story of one of the teachers that I worked with. So let's take a beat. Ralph Ellison, famous Oklahoma educator, his quote says, "Education is all a matter of building bridges. Building bridges is about connection. This project is an attempt to help us as Oklahomans to connect with our own history, which informs a very real part of who we are today. So everything that is painful and horrifying is a real part of who we are, and denying it does not let us off the hook for experiencing its after effects." Moving on, this is a picture of a gigantic, famous dust storm that happened on April 14th, 1935. And that is a photo that appeared, this was near Beaver, Oklahoma. I can't remember what newspaper this appeared in, but it's a very famous, well-known storm. So the making of the Dust Bowl, there were a lot of things that sort of coalesced. There was poor soil management, over-farming, stripping prairie grasses, economic crash, obviously, in 1929, and at least 3 separate droughts. It wasn't one drought that lasted an entire decade. We just kept getting hammered with drought after drought. There were agricultural scientists at the time who were trying to get farmers to change their practices. They knew that a disaster was coming, and those scientists were kicked out of the scientific community. They were forcibly silenced and ostracized. So this is obviously Dorothea Lange's famous picture of a migrant mother. This was in 1936. Most of the migrants who left Oklahoma were actually tenant farmers from eastern Oklahoma. We think of them as, we think of the Okies as, it must have been all those people whose crops turned to dust. Those people couldn't leave. Tenant farmers who didn't own anything were able to leave. Californians, not many people know this, formed posses. They literally built barriers at the border to keep out the hobo horde. There were a lot of fears about Oklahomans taking immigrants' jobs, and the reason that would have been a disaster is that landowners were afraid that they would have to pay white workers more than they were paying Mexican and Asian immigrants. We lost 440,000 citizens. I think that's just in 1934. That was the migration number in 1934. And then this is a quote from a fictionalized memoir you may have read, The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. At one point, her family's traveling through Oklahoma. She says, "You know you're down and out when Okies laugh at you. With our garbage bag taped window, our tied down hood, and art supplies strapped to the roof, we had out-Okied the Okies." And Okie, by the way, is a word that our mother did not allow us to say. She said, that is not a nice thing. Don't use that word. And that's what it meant to be an Okie in the 20th century. So now we're going to hear Marian's story. And I want you to think in particular about relational ruptures here and how they have shaped Marian's life and expectations.
I probably shouldn't be driving all the way over here to your office. I really can't feel the pedals in my car anymore with my neuropathy, but if I didn't drive, I'd go crazy. I kind of go by muscle memory. My son keeps saying, "Mom, you're 87 years old. You have to slow down." But if I do that, I know it's the beginning of the end. I tell him the only thing wrong with me is my depression, and I've had that pretty much my whole life. I don't know why. I've had a good life. Good family, they loved me, I never went hungry, and there's lots of folks that did. I mean, things were hard sometimes. Everybody has hard times. After my brother died in that accident with the wood stove, Daddy took to drinking, and Mama had to do everything. I was just 3 or 4 months old when that happened, so I only remembered my daddy drinking and my mama mad. I think the only time Mama was proud of me was when I started dating my first husband. I wasn't supposed to be dating because I was only 15. But after what happened on our first date when he took advantage of me and I got pregnant, Mama was happy. "Make him marry you," was all she would say to me. "You'll be taken good care of if he stays in the Air Force." And of course, I knew they couldn't really afford for me to live at home. I can't say I'm sorry I married him because I wouldn't have my 3 oldest if I hadn't married him, but he was a mean old cuss. He ran around on me all the time, and he was so mean when he got home that I didn't mind after a while. I stopped going back out to look for him. I was just glad he was beating on someone else and not me. Now Jack, he was a good man. When I left my first husband, Jack was the first nice man I ever dated. He was so kind to me. That was what kept me with him, even with the drinking. And it was the drinking that killed him when my kids with him was just still in elementary school. That was hard, working 2, 3 jobs just to keep us in that little shack of a house. My kids all want me to move out of it now and go to assisted living, but I know what happens when you leave your home. You lose your mental faculties, and then they stick you in a nursing home. I'm going to die in my little shack with the leaky roof and all my mental faculties.
So you can hear some of the legacy of the extreme hard times of the Dust Bowl. Some other aspects of that Dust Bowl legacy, where, as this quote says, some people only stayed because they didn't have a way to leave. Other states developed a real animosity toward Oklahoma because a lot of the dust storms were red, and the belief was that that was Oklahoma red soil. Probably some of it was. I mean, there was a huge dust storm that hit New York City, full of red dust. Oklahoma's population did not just decline in the 30s, it continued to decline through the 1950s until the oil booms of the 60s. So Steinbeck was working for a San Francisco paper at the time of the Dust Bowl, and his editor sent him to the Little Oklahomas to do a story about the folks who were refugees there. And you can find all of those articles. They eventually became his novel, The Grapes of Wrath. Part of what moved him to write was the idea that white people like him, were living like migrants or people of color. So even some of the things that were designed to raise cultural awareness, to ignite compassion, depended on racist bias to do so. This picture, by the way, is my family. This is, my mom's the little one there. This was probably about 1945. She's the only one, I think, without a gun in this picture, but don't worry. Don't worry, she gets her gun. She used to hunt squirrels for dinner. Those are two of her older brothers. Her oldest brother at this time was serving in the Navy in World War II. So some of the things that we see in folks who survived that era are food hoarding. You probably have an older relative that did some of this. There's this enduring scarcity mentality, an unwillingness to spend money or use all the food, keeping a ton of canned food. And just health-wise, epigenetically, there's premature aging in subsequent generations. We're still studying the impacts of the Dust Bowl today. So the 20th century is really the story of boom and bust. And I often think that there are kind of two kinds of Oklahomans. There's boom and bust Oklahomans, and then there's labor conquers all Oklahomans. Does anybody know why labor conquers all is a thing? It's the state motto, yeah. Yeah, I have presented to crowds where no one knew that. But thank you, so yeah. Labor conquers all is our state motto, and I just want you to reflect on that in the context of all of this, right? What is the hope that motto is expressing? So policy and culture throughout the 20th century, racial tensions continued. The first law passed by the newly minted Oklahoma State Senate in 1907, does anybody know what that law was? Senate Bill 1? What was it? It was not. It was actually a law segregating railway cars. So it was a Jim Crow law, but it was to segregate railway cars. That was just the first of many Jim Crow laws passed in Oklahoma. Again, eradication of indigenous cultures was the official federal policy until the 1970s. We have always in this state had pro-oil company tax policies, which means that oil companies, which make a lot of money, do not pay much in taxes. And then they get federal bailouts when there are when there are bust cycles in the boom and bust oil economy. There was also throughout the 20th century kind of a growing appreciation for Native culture and a desire to make Oklahoma more culturally relevant. So if you were alive during this time, you probably remember seeing more sort of Oklahoma, Native America, and a little less of the sort of cowboy, like white people-centric imagery. But often that imagery, the Native imagery was pretty shallow, it was fairly exploitative. We cannot talk about Oklahoma without talking about natural disasters, because every now and then our sky tries to kill us. The deadliest tornado in Oklahoma happened in Woodward in 1947. 116 fatalities, over 700 wounded. This picture, by the way, was the May 3rd, 1999 tornado in Moore. The 1999 tornado, speaking of, was the second most deadly. 36 killed, 583 wounded. Who lived here for that? I did, yeah. That was some scary stuff. And then the May 2013 tornadoes, 24 killed, 212 wounded. Who lived here for that? Yeah, I was doing home base at that time. I managed to get into a stranger's storm cellar with a bunch of other strangers. Tornadoes until about the 1980s were pretty unpredictable. Then there were advancements in radar technology. And by the way, Oklahoma has the best radar technology for tracking storms. No other state, no matter how many tornadoes they are subject to, no other state has the kind of sophistication that we have here. When I have described to people, yeah, they'll tell us exactly which intersections it will be at and when. They are flabbergasted. They cannot believe that technology exists. So something to keep in mind about our natural disaster history is that there is a persistent threat of annihilation. How does that shape who we are? How does that shape our psyche? How does it shape our expectations of the future? We cannot, again, talk about Oklahoma without talking about terrorism. The first terrorist act committed in Oklahoma was an act of white supremacist terrorism, the race massacre, unknown death toll, at least 300 estimated dead. Again, no prosecution, no reparation, no attempts at restorative justice have ever been made. The Roger Dale Stafford murders, who remembers those? Yeah, he murdered a family of 3 in southeastern Oklahoma on a highway, and then he came to Oklahoma City and murdered teenagers, employees of a Sirloin stockade. The Edmond post office shooting, 1986, anybody remember that? It was sort of the origins of the going postal stereotype, but it was a real tragedy that happened here. 14 people were killed by a military person who had an automatic weapon. There have been so many mass shootings that I could not include them all. Mass shootings are actually shockingly common. We just had one last weekend. And then, of course, the bombing of the Murrah building in 1995, which was another act of white supremacist terrorism. This was framed by Merrick Garland, who prosecuted the case, as a lone wolf activity. It was not. I highly recommend the book Homegrown. It's a fairly new release just in the past few years, and I cannot think off the top of my head who the author is, but it really details, he did a deep dive into Timothy McVeigh's life and into his network. There were dozens of people across the country who knew what he was going to do. Did you find the author? Jeffrey Toobin. Toobin, is that right? There were dozens of people who knew exactly what was going to happen, who supported him, who aided and abetted him. Nearly 700 wounded. One of the things that always bothers me about the death toll when it's listed is that it does not include the subsequent suicides, particularly of first responders. And I have worked with quite a few of those first responders, especially after they retired, and the trauma is absolutely crushing. The bombing obviously, but all of the terrorist activity that we've experienced in this state creates another enduring legacy. So let's talk about intergenerational trauma. There's a term they use in public health, weathering, which refers to the accumulation of chronic stress over years, decades, and generations, specifically due to racism and oppression. And the effect of it is that it compromises our body's ability to ward off infections, to be resilient around aging. Black and Indigenous communities, for this reason, have some of the worst health outcomes today. That is not a genetic destiny. That is the direct result of white supremacist oppression. There have also been quite a few genocide survivor and descendant studies. There is a kind of PTSD that lives in the descendants of survivors of genocides. There's also frequently a conspiracy of silence after the event. This is particularly true for the Tulsa massacre because everyone who orchestrated it remained in positions of power, and people were terrified to talk about it, literally for decades. This was something I found really fascinating. Shaklee Topalian talks in her 2013 article about children of Holocaust survivors, specifically Holocaust survivors who disavowed or would not talk about their experiences, had great difficulty using metaphors, fantasizing. Their verbalizations were concrete. They were unable to structure past, present, and future time. What that means to me is that when we do not work with our trauma, live with our trauma, we lose our capacity to imagine. These photos are from the Race Massacre Memorial in Tulsa. What themes repeat in our history? You can hear it. I heard somebody say repetition compulsion a little while ago. Like we are analysts, right? We understand these things. What were people looking for when they came here? What was that leading edge that brought them here? People looked for peace, safety, prosperity, stability, freedom to exist, literally to exist. And Oklahoma was their last best hope. What happened to those hopes? These are lyrics written by Wayne Coyne. Do y'all know who he is? He is the lead singer of the Flaming Lips, which is Oklahoma's state sort of rock band. Oklahoma's rock song that we elected to be our state rock song is a Flaming Lips song. The first line of which, by the way, is, "Do you realize that everyone you know is going to die?" We chose that. Did God make pain so we can know the high that nothing is? In an interview with the Rolling Stone about his album, The Terror, he says, if we have love, if we have love, know love, and are truly alive, and if there is no love, there would be no life. In the terror, we know now that even without love, life goes on. We just go on. There is no mercy killing. Which brings us to the red dirt mentality. What are Oklahomans known for, characterologically? What's the stereotype, right? There's a lot of pride, there's pride in never asking for help. My friend who works at the health department lost grant money that provided free reproductive health care to teenagers because it came from the federal government, and we don't like that. We don't like that here. Pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. By the way, I just have a little soapbox about this saying because I hear it all the time. This originally developed as a sarcastic way to describe a thing that is impossible. You cannot pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It does not work. That's not a thing. And we act like that's our goal. The Oklahoma Standard, right? That came to be a phrase tossed around after the Oklahoma City bombing when there was like a mile-long line of people wanting to donate blood, wanting to donate time, willing to do anything to help in the wake of that tragedy. Helping neighbors with a little asterisk, we're going to talk about the limitations around that. You're doing fine, Oklahoma, which my professor, Dr. Dave Pasto, who's here today, used to tell us was written by a couple of guys in New York who had never been to Oklahoma. That's our state song, guys. Oklahoma's okay, I guess. What would I know? God's country. I hear people describe Oklahoma as God's country, and that phrase appears probably a lot in some of the music written by our very, very famous country stars from the state. There's an acceptance of random natural disasters as acts of God, right? God didn't want more to exist. And then there's a tendency, right, to claim righteousness or the high ground. And again, self-righteousness is the poor man's self-esteem. So that pride, that self-righteousness is a grandiosity that serves to protect a deep sense of shame. There is really a conviction that no help is coming. And when we talked about the Tulsa Race Massacre, when we talked about the Dust Bowl, even the land runs, if you were one of the people displaced or traumatically impacted by those events, nobody was coming to help you. Feeling that we're completely on our own. We turn this into that's why we do the bootstrap thing that is impossible. Judging some situations and people as worthy of compassion and others as unworthy. So here's what I've noticed. If we can't find a way to blame you for your problem, we are going to give you all the help in the world. Do you need blood? Do you need a pallet of bottles of water? Do you need a place to stay? If we can find a way to blame you, if you're unhoused, if your bank has repossessed your home or your car, well, that's just choices. That's just bad decisions, right? We don't even want you to have free meals at school if you're a hungry child. There's a resignation about life's unfairness, and this is often tossed out to justify cruel policies. Well, no, life's not fair. So these immigrant children came here and didn't have a choice not to. Tough. Life's hard. Feeling trapped or stuck? I've talked to a lot of people who fantasize about leaving the state, and in the same breath will say it'll never happen. That's just not going to happen. We do have also a tendency to deny our own pain. We dismiss and minimize pain. You heard that in the first vignette in Angela's story. A lot of people have it worse. How many of you hear that on a regular basis? Yep. How many of you say that on a regular basis, Sharon? Helping others to keep from focusing on our own pain. Again, this is something I saw in retiring first responders. I worked in an integrated pain management program for a while. They retired from these jobs where they were literally running into burning buildings to rescue babies and adults. And when they stopped being able to run into the building, when their body said, no more, the trauma hit them full force like a locomotive. Externalizing all badness onto the other, University of Texas, East Coast elites, immigrants, right? Unhoused people, queer people, trans people in particular, being overly controlling. So there's all this stuff we can't control, right? We don't get to choose the weather. We don't get to choose when the sky decides to throw baseballs at us. And so we get overly controlling of other things. They snuck in a measure right before they shut down the legislative session to deprive anybody of any possibility of using a pill that might sometimes also be used for abortion care. We tend to feel really disenfranchised from any sense of agency. And you're going to hear that in the case that I talk about in my paper in particular. But I also resonate deeply with that myself. And often when I'm sitting with someone who is very disenfranchised from their agency, I find myself sort of agreeing. Right? I find myself thinking, yeah, life does suck. And you're right, then you do die. Feeling disenfranchised from our own goodness. This is why we turn to self-righteousness, because we actually don't even believe in our own goodness. If we could feel connected to an inner sense of goodness, to the person, the part of us that Mr. Rogers was talking to, that said, you are the only person in the world who is you, and people can like you exactly as you are. We have forgotten that, or we don't believe it. So how does this show up in patients? These are actual quotes that I've heard in my practice. I'm sure you've heard it in yours. Life sucks and then you die. Doesn't really matter what I do. SSDD, what does that mean? Same shit, different day. Everybody knew that. Something's going to kill me. Does it really matter what? It's not what I wanted, but that's just how life is. There's often an undercurrent of passive suicidality. I've worked with a lot of people who will literally drive into a tornado because, you know, their wife's grandma needs help getting into her cellar on the other side of the storm. And when I brought that up, like, that's an incredibly dangerous thing to do. And they're like, something's gonna kill me. Resignation. Feelings of shame and helplessness that are likely to present in counterintuitive ways. Again, there's a lot of projection. There's sometimes a fixation on an other group. I hear trans folks, liberals generally, kind of falling into that category. Difficulty metabolizing shame. And this is one of the ways that I talk about shame, is that shame has survived an evolutionary process to exist in us today, and it serves us. I disagree with Brené Brown. I think she's done a lot of amazing work and has helped a lot of people, and I think shame is actually our friend when we can metabolize it. When we get stuck in it and are sort of in that quicksand drowning in it and we're the worst person in the world and why does anybody love us, that's actually also a defense against shame. That is a way of not dealing with the actual shame that is. Trouble regulating self-esteem, right? Projecting or internalizing. Again, that's an attempt to mitigate really dealing with shame. How does this show up in us? I mean, a lot of the same ways, honestly, right? Feeling stuck, resonating with our clients in unhelpful ways. The clinical situation that I'm going to describe in my paper, I do all of these things. So much of them. Rushing to fix, to comfort, sometimes to cheer. Focusing on symptoms instead of underlying issues. I don't think that that's as common among those of us who are psychodynamically informed, but it is almost exclusively what a lot of other people focus on. Feeling frustrated, feeling bad about ourselves, right? Blaming ourselves when we don't see improvement or results or transformation. Resenting clients. That's actually one of the tells for me that something is activated in me that I'm not letting myself deal with. If I start resenting a patient, then I need to really think about what is happening, right? And then I take it to consultation. Feeling our own shame, drowning in it, kind of wallowing in it, or defending against it. So I chose a supercell for this slide because the thing that I kind of like about the jargon that we use in ISP is that it strikes me as like pleasantly meteorological. I like the idea of trailing edge of it. You know, it sounds like something that Mike Morgan would say when he's like, you know, rooting for his team, which is kind of how I think of tornado coverage in Oklahoma. So trailing edge, that dread to repeat past relational ruptures or traumas. And I just recently read Agi Sakatopoulou's Sexuality Beyond Consent. Highly, highly recommended. It's so brilliant. And she talks about how we have sort of become a traumatophobic society. Not in the sense that, you know, we naturally traumas are painful and we want to avoid them when possible, but in the sense that we feel like all trauma must be fixed or healed, that if trauma doesn't have a healed experience like a broken bone, then somehow the therapy hasn't worked. And actually what we know, if we've done this work for a while, is that is not a thing. Healing from trauma is not a thing. So she advocates for a traumatophilic approach, which is returning to the trauma not in a compulsive, repetitive way that is the trailing edge, but in a way that can potentially transform our relationship with that trauma so that what we do with it in our lives feels integrated and resonant with our values. Trailing edge is that upside down version of our hopes. These are the fears that keep us safe. And when I say keep us safe, I don't mean literally, objectively, they do a great job and we shouldn't change a thing, right? I mean, these are the things that keep us in a small, maybe a little prison cell with no windows, but at least we know what to expect. It preserves that status quo, no matter how crappy the status quo actually is. And this is the image that I have chosen to represent that trailing edge for Oklahomans is the Frady hole. Now, the leading edge is the hope for a different ending. Again, this is where I think that we benefit more from thinking of trauma as something to live with rather than something to fix and tie up with a neat little bow. But a lot of people come to therapy really desperately hoping for exactly that. Yearning for freedom from the trauma cycle. So we return to the scene of the trauma in therapy, but not in a compulsive, repetitive way, hopefully. I mean, enactments happen, right? But hopefully we can transform those experiences by recognizing them and being able to talk about them. Leading edge is characterized by an empathy that pulls us forward. And empathy is the capacity to imagine another person's experience from their perspective. It is not projecting how I would feel if I were in that situation. That's the best a lot of people get to, but empathy is a discipline where we discipline our imagination and discipline ourselves through deep listening and attunement so that we can accurately imagine what someone else is experiencing from their perspective. That empathy pulls us into growth, authenticity, intimate connectedness. And it is the positive opposite of the trailing edge. So positive opposite is a CBT term. I recognize that. But I do find it useful, right? It's when we get really focused on the trailing edge, it's easy to feel kind of discouraged. But if we go deep enough, we can find the positive opposite. We can find the yearning. These pictures of the monarch life cycle, by the way, that happened on my back porch in 2021. It was so cool. We got to see the whole process and the brand new butterfly. Her wings were still wet when I took that picture. So thinking about the trailing edge, we can ask ourselves, what strength is being expressed, even if it's coming from a raw or fragmented place? So sometimes a symptom is actually a strength being expressed through trauma that is untransformed, unintegrated. What would it look like for that strength to come from a place of integration? Think about Angela's situation with her kids and her ex-husband and her mom. Dustin's situation, Shauna. Shauna actually did some of this, right? Shauna found a way to transform something that was devastatingly just hard and disappointing and demoralizing into something that felt empowering. And then what would healing, what would integration, what would that strength that Marian expresses, what would that look like if it were coming from a place of less self-recrimination and depression? So the Frady holes, again, are where we're hiding to stay safe. They're not going to move us forward, but they do help us to survive. And I have a lot of respect for that. So take this with you. This is just kind of the beginnings of me imagining a red dirt leading edge. Think about where that red dirt mentality shows up in you. How does it show up in your family? How does it show up in your patients? How does it resonate with your own trailing edge? And how do you shift into an empathic, reality-based, hope-oriented stance? So some of that happens through grounding ourselves. One of the things that I need to do to ground myself, and one of the situations where I most encounter this need, is when my shame is triggered. And at that moment, what is most helpful to me is to let it happen. let it wash over me, and recognize that I probably earned some of this shame. And I'm gonna be okay. I just have to let it flow, and then, encounter compassionate witness. One of the things that we provide for people is a way to help them metabolize their painful experiences through our compassionate witness and co-creation of a safe emotional relational environment. Feeling our way into our client's lived experience, finding the strength in the woundedness. Again, there's a lot of pressure from insurance companies, sometimes from agencies, from various sort of third-party actors, and not always third-party. Like sometimes patients are equally impatient for us to just get to the symptom, like fix the symptom. I cannot deal with this anymore. But sometimes there is something really important being expressed in that symptom that will help us find the leading edge. And again, the traumatic-philic rather than traumatic-phobic approach, being afraid to go to those deeply painful places. And I don't know that we would be in this field if we were genuinely terrified of doing that. But I do think that sometimes I encounter a kind of resistance within myself. There's something I want to say, there's something I want to touch. I'm afraid it will be too painful. And so pay attention to those moments. Again, Ralph Ellison, a wonderful Oklahoma leader. Life is to be lived, not controlled. And humanity is won by continuing to play in the face of certain defeat. So you hear the trailing edge there, right? But you also hear a transforming initiative, right? A yearning for transformation and a faith that transformation is possible. This is Clara Luper, one of our great civil rights leaders. I came from a family of believers. We believed in the sun when it didn't shine. We believed in the rain when it wasn't raining. My parents taught me to believe in a God I couldn't see. And again, this is a uniquely Okie leading edge expression. We're going to come back to these quotes in my paper as well. This is the end of the first part here. So I have so many references, it just goes on and on. This was a lot of work. So go ahead, take a break, 15 minutes. Does that sound good? All right, 15 minutes, be back at 10:45.